Good to go.
Okay, today I'll be talking to you about three separate philosophies: absurdism, existentialism, and nihilism. And honestly, they are intensely difficult to understand, so I recommend you pay attention the whole time. Well, the one thing that does link all three of the philosophies is the concept of the absurd. What the absurd is an idea which is derived from both the human inability to find meaning in the universe and the fact that, quite frankly, the universe has no meaning to give. It doesn't mean that it's logically impossible to find any meaning in the universe, but it means that, quite frankly, we can't do it as humans. So it's important to remember that just the universe not having meaning and us not being able to find it do not make the absurd. Both together make this concept which provides a foundation for all three philosophies.
Oh.
Well, the first one, and ironically the simplest one, which I'll explain to you, is nihilism. And nihilism is exactly the stereotypical philosophy you think of when you say, there's no meaning, this is pointless. That's exactly what nihilism is. As a matter of fact, nihilism states that everything is meaningless, everything is false, which many people have critiqued, saying that by saying that, you're contradicting your own statement. It's important to remember that nihilism doesn't provide for any morals or emotions in life either. Everything is pointless. Human life, insignificant. The universe means nothing. Anything you try to bring from that or any meaning you apply to life in a nihilist view is just contrived and false.
Did
Existentialism.
y'all get that?
Wait, could we go back for like a second?
Yeah,
Okay.
go back.
So much information, it's just so hard to get.
Again, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask.
Go back to the yeah, thank you. Just for a second.
Did you just move the board with your finger?
Yeah, can we have someone record that too?
Okay.
Is there a question, Brandon?
No.
Okay.
Is it saying that it's not humanly, it's humanly impossible to find meaning?
Yes.
Okay.
It doesn't mean necessarily that you rationally can't. It just means that within the scope of our lives, there's no possibilities. Is everybody about good?
Yeah.
Can we go to the next one though? Okay, thank you.
Although there is some complexity and irony to this one, really you should just remember that nothing means anything. There's no meaning in the universe at all in any form or fashion.
Could you explain how this is ironic?
Well, one of the main critiques against nihilism throughout the ages has been in that by formulating the idea of nihilism, you're trying to attach a meaning or significance to the universe and the way it functions, which, as a matter of fact, contradicts the essence of what nihilism actually is.
Is it more of a statement than belief? Because is it belief against itself?
Well, I'm sure those that subscribe to it would certainly call it a belief, but I think it can be summed down to the statement that there is no meaning in the universe. Ready? Are we good? Existentialism. This is more of what people live their lives by every day. It's a much more common philosophy. Anyway, it says that one of the founding aspects of existentialism is the idea that existence precedes essence. And let me explain that for a bit, because I understand you may not immediately get that. But essentially what it's saying is that just because you exist, it does not mean that you have any intrinsic meaning or any specific essence or aspect to your existence. pretty much what it's saying is that a person is not a person until they've created their own meaning. Just because they exist does not mean they have any significance. And this actually is a quote from Soren Kierkegaard, who's regarded as the first existentialist. If you somehow get into the philosophy, I recommend reading him. But anyway, he says that subjectivism is truth, and truth is subjectivism. And really, that's the basis of all existentialism. Existentialism is the idea that there's no grand meaning in the universe, the absurd is still an issue, but you can make meaning in your own life based upon what's important to you. So there's no grand purpose to anything, but each person is important and can have their own meaning, such as if religion is what gets you through it, religion is meaning. And not only that, but existentialism would say that that subjectivism, that meaning you create for yourself, is just as important as any meaning which the universe could provide if we were able to get to it. And lastly, existentialism does say that angst and despair, which are common themes in an existentialist crisis, are common and are natural byproducts of the human experience. But however, it says to have hope in that you can create your own meaning, so there's no reason to despair. Is everybody good? Any questions on that one? No need to be shy. This is very difficult to understand. Okay, how many of you think you have a good grasp on absurdism so far? Okay, well, if you raise your hand, you might not be as correct as you think, because by nature, even Camus says, absurdism is almost impossible to understand, simply in the fact that it contradicts itself.
The expert.
Absurdism, of course, is based firmly upon the idea of the absurd, which, remember, is that the human cannot find meaning and the universe cannot provide it. Absurdism, very similar to existentialism, by the way, states that a human can create subjective meaning in their lives, but unlike existentialism, this subjective meaning is just that, it's subjective. It does not mean that the meaning you provide in your life serves any great purpose in any way. It just means, essentially, that it's how you get through the day. Any questions on that? I'm going to talk about absurdism a little bit. Yes?
So the difference between the nihilism and absurdism is just that one of them says that you can have subjective meaning even though it doesn't mean anything? Or?
That's a very good question. At the end, I'm going to compare all of the
Okay.
philosophies, and I'm going to talk about absurdism a little bit.
Okay, got it.
So I'll see if I address it.
All right, thank you.
All right. The myth of Sisyphus, of course, was mentioned in the previous presentation, and I merely wanted to provide this because, quite honestly, absurdism is the hardest philosophy to understand. It's the most specific, and as a matter of fact, it contradicts itself. But through Sisyphus, Camus provided a fairly clear analogy into the way that the absurd ideal works. First off, in the myth of Sisyphus, Camus defined that there were 3 ways that one could deal with realizing the absurd existed. And prior to this, he says that there's a point in everyone's life where you realize the absurd, where you suddenly take note of the fact that there's not a grand meaning and I can't find any. So the 3 ways which Camus addressed this were either by suicide, a leap of faith, or recognition of the absurd. First of all, suicide. Camus actually, in the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus, says there is only one philosophical problem in the world, and that is suicide. To him, suicide was essentially a confession that life was not worth living because the universe has no meaning. But at the same time, he did not support or advocate that people take this path. He just provided that it was a logical reaction to realizing the absurd. Secondly, he provided that a person could take a leap of faith upon realizing the absurd. this wasn't necessarily religion, but often it was, and it meant that people would derive their meaning from a higher power or the way that they live their life through faith. And to him, however, this was sort of a rational suicide, as Camus felt that by taking a leap of faith, one was merely choosing to ignore the absurd rather than deal with it, which of course brings us to our third point, which is recognition of the absurd. And this was how Camus believed the ideal absurdist person should live. Essentially, when one recognizes the absurd in its existence, the person acknowledges that absurd existence and then continues to exist anyway. And to him, that was the ideal life. That's what life meant. And actually, he believed that there was a freedom to this recognition. He felt that anyone who hadn't made the recognition yet was actually trapping themselves within the absurd. So within the myth of Sisyphus, for those of you who don't know, it's about essentially a Greek criminal who in the afterlife is punished by rolling a boulder up a hill, having it come down, lather, rinse, repeat. And specifically what Camus found important about this analogy was the moment where Sisyphus is coming down the hill from rolling up the boulder. He believed that in that moment, Sisyphus was taking in what the absurd meant, and yet he was continuing to move anyway. And in this sense, Sisyphus was the ideal absurdist. Along those lines, he quotes that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. So not only does Sisyphus continue doing his job, the fact that he's recognized the absurd, he's happy to do it. That's how he exists, and he's completely free. At the same time, however, this is towards the contradictory nature of absurdism. Hope is not an aspect of absurdism like it is in existentialism. Quite honestly, Camus said to hope within absurdism was merely to delude yourself. So although you can create subjective meaning and live freely, you shouldn't hope that it's going to find you some greater meaning, because that's not within the absurd at all. Any questions on absurdism before I move on? No? Awesome. All right, lastly, I'm going to compare the three philosophies. Thank you for teaching. First off, I would simply say that nihilism has no hope and no meaning in any fashion. Absurdism also excludes hope and grand meaning, but it does provide for the fact that you can create subjective meaning in your life. That may not be necessarily significant, but nihilism crosses out that possibility altogether, and absurdism doesn't. Existentialism, however, is based completely on the fact that you create your own subjective meaning, just like absurdism. But again, in absurdism, this subjective meaning is not greatly significant. It's merely what allows you to live in free coexistence with the absurd. And lastly, to differentiate between absurdism and existentialism, because they're very similar, absurdism does not allow one to hope for greater meaning. Existentialism says that when you create subjective meaning, there is hope that this subjective meaning will become the greater meaning in your universe. But with absurdism, the subjective meaning is nothing more than a way for you to live without suicide. And that's all for now. Any more questions before we go into the interactive portion?
Is subjective meaning kind of like the idea that you were born with some kind of meaning?
Right. I believe that in this sense, subjective meaning is more based upon nurture than nature, in that it's what's more significant is how you develop and what becomes important to you. I feel that an absurdist would say that any meaning you're born with is objective and thus does not exist.
Which one of these